I'm sure we'll capture some cool footage that we might use for all types of things, really. Sorry, I made this decision to turn on this light, and I gotta decide if it's worth it. This is so dramatic, but it's getting a little too dark. Let's keep this a lot more consistent. Yeah, I like this.
You might get a little bit more out of that too.
If I open it, yeah. Now that it's...
I get it.
Okay. Yeah. That's good. Tiny bit. Too much. Okay. Alright, Bill, well,
Dun, dun, dun.
dun 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 dun. Let's start off. What is your name? And what is CCFA? And we can chat about that a little. Like, you don't have to take the full answer, but
Well, yeah, my name is my given name is William James Ford. But yeah, I go by Bill, so Bill Ford, and I used to always make the joke that I am the Bilford. People always call Bills Bilford, and my name is Bill Ford. So
I've never heard of that. Is that it's just a nickname for Bill, or?
I've just heard people say that, kind of like I don't know, like Steve-O or something like that. They're like, hey, Bilford.
Bilford.
And I'm like, yeah, that's my name.
That's cool. I've never heard that one. It makes me think of like Wilfred.
Right.
Bilfred.
But yeah, so CCFA, it's a organization that, basically sprung from my need to tell my story and my experience. My mother committed suicide when I was a child, 16 years old, and about 4 years ago, I had a very serious suicide attempt. It wasn't my first attempt, but it was the most serious. And one of the things that came out of that was this desire to figure out how to talk about it more and figure out a way to make it easier for people to talk about suicide, and really an everyday conversation. Because that was one of my biggest experiences, was that anytime I brought up my feelings that, I was suicidal, that it caused a lot of anxiety and problems for that person that I said that to, and therefore a lot of problems in our relationship, whoever that may have been. And so yeah, I started taking some public speaking classes, trying to figure out how to tell my story to people, and just not with this vague idea of it needing to happen. And then I got into acting classes, and it was really during my experience at Turkey Shorts, which is a thing that happens at Lane every fall, that the Student Production Association puts on. That it's a group of short plays that are about 10 minutes long. They're supposed to be 10 minutes long, but but yeah, it was just during that experience that I really got the feeling of how wonderful a medium that could be for telling this message and getting these stories out there of what people have gone through, and how we could maybe better, learn to better deal with it, and just find a place where we understand it a little bit more than we do now. And so that's kind of where CCFA came from.
Lovely. Lovely. That's a great intro, and that's where we met during that same Turkey Shorts. And yeah, I appreciate everything we're trying to do here. But as far as talking about it, like on my end of that, I get those same things where it does bring up anxiety. The subject, there's a certain amount of weight on it that brings up anxiety. So when somebody it's almost, you could relate it to when a person says like, oh, I'm so like fat, or like, oh, I hate this about me. You're like, don't make it worse, I guess. As somebody watching, you're like, don't make it worse.
Right.
But I think the unwanted effect of that is an isolation. There's this detachment between the two parties, because what's happening is that subject is getting in the way of them being authentic to each other.
Precisely.
And it's just so tough, because I think like the amount of weight put on politeness might keep human interaction from happening in sometimes. And it's just it's something to balance, I guess.
Well, no, you're absolutely right, and it's something I've said for, I mean, honestly, decades, is that one of the most prevalent or actually talked about mental illnesses in America is honesty. That we all have our mental illnesses, we all have our issues that we deal with, but the people that are labeled are the ones that are honest, are the ones that are open and are trying to cope with it and are trying to deal with it on a, honest and transparent level. And they are labeled and in a lot of ways marginalized from society because of that honesty. And it's very damaging to society in general, not to mention what it does to those individuals.
Yes. And as from my own journey in life, like, I would just tell myself that I was totally fine for a long time, right? And I would just avoid even thinking about those subjects. But as my self-awareness started to grow, I did tune into like, oh, this is really hard for me, and that's okay. And like acknowledging that is actually a strong thing, not something to be avoided.
Yeah, it's self-care as much as, increasing your exercise regimen because your health is failing, or any number of things that we do to maintain ourselves and to try to, like when you try to eat better because you're gaining weight, or you're trying to, gain weight in certain ways or something, There's so many different things we do and that are not only socially acceptable, but very much encouraged throughout society. But when it comes to mental health, as much as it's encouraged on a surface level, in practice, in actual society, it is honestly pretty discouraged. We're not enabled to seek help very easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that your story, there are a lot of footnotes in your story that kind of highlight that. Unfortunately, yeah. But digging into those, I think, is going to be a really valuable thing for us. Going back to the first time, well, I wouldn't know if it was the first time that that you encountered suicide in your life, but when your mother committed suicide, tell us about that, and about how I know personally that I guess it wasn't talked about as specifically as suicide in the community even.
Yeah.
So I feel like that is a place where, well, why don't you tell the story and then.
Yeah, well, my mother, she was a high school math teacher in the high school I went to, and we were a very small town. The high school was for our town and like the 5 surrounding towns basically, and it was 7th through 12th grade. And there was like maybe 600 kids or something like that in the whole school. And so my mom had worked there for I think like 12 years, maybe even longer at that point. And so like most of the region had her for math at one point. It's pretty intense, loss for the whole community. Like, just to bring some perspective, it's like at that point in my life at 16, I had never been in a gathering of as many people as I was at her funeral. It was, overwhelming on so many different levels. I mean, just, the support and, recognition of, love that, my mom had inspired was, wonderful. But there was this certain amount of jealousy too, just this like, I don't know, it's like, well, and then like you asked about there was this barrier where it wasn't being talked about that it was a suicide. And that was, to me, it was more expressed as just not polite. And that, and almost in that light of, you shouldn't talk badly about the dead, type of a thing.
So at that point, what are some ways that were okay to talk about her, and then what was off limits? Well,
I was 16, so I didn't really pay attention to limits very much. Really, I mean, honestly, it's like, at that point of your life and in dealing with a traumatic tragedy like that, it's like, I was problematic. I was hard to handle, I was, not what, I don't know, it's, because it's like there was this really tough situation in the whole town where everybody was grieving this loss of, a friend or a coworker or a mentor or a teacher or even just someone they knew, you know what I mean? And it was like everybody was dealing with that. But she was my mom. I didn't really care what anybody else was dealing with, you know what I mean? And I don't know, it got to be really isolating, like just that constant need and looking for, everybody else was basically looking for information and support too, and as much as they all like recognized that I needed it and they all tried to reach out, it's like, everybody, in a situation like that, you're not really able to listen, and all you can do is feel what you're feeling. And so when you try to respond to other people, you're giving them what you need, and you're not listening to what they need. And that was one of my main experiences, was that I didn't have anybody that I could talk to about what I needed and what I was going through. Even like, I'd gone to therapy and stuff like that, and even in a lot of those situations, it was just, brought to a larger level instead of like, on a microcosm of what I was dealing with. And, I ended up like, I dropped out of high school my senior year because I just couldn't deal with the environment. I don't know how else to put it, of just that, the oppression of everybody trying to make sure I was all right. And, and them grieving themselves. And it got to a point to where, it was just such an extremely toxic environment for me that I had to escape. And I moved to Florida from my hometown, and yeah, that's a whole nother.
Is that Fort Lauderdale?
Yeah.
I want to hear some stories about that, but not yet. Do you remember having, in that time where you were feeling isolated and it was feeling like a toxic environment, were there things you wish people would say to you, or things you wished you would say that just didn't get said? Or was there things being said but not having the right reaction to them?
I think what is needed more than anything is the understanding that words are too easily misunderstood, and that really just being there is kind of more important. And that's like what I felt like people weren't able to do. It's like anytime I tried to be around somebody, they, tried to fix the grief. They tried to, make me feel better, tried to cheer me up, or try to, relate to it. And, but on, in some way they tried to, do what they thought was best. But it seemed like to me that on almost every occasion that all their words did were kind of, perpetuate it, because it wasn't, it was just kind of misunderstood. Mm-hmm. And that really what would have, I think, helped most is, like I said, if people could have just been there and, maybe listened more without even replying, and that's something that, I don't know, I've tried to practice and I know I'm not good at still, because it's so hard to hear somebody going through something and not try to apply your experiences and your advice to what they're saying, but you don't understand. I mean, just point blank, you can't mm-hmm. understand what somebody else is going through. It doesn't matter how well you believe you know somebody. I mean, like my wife and I have been together, we've been married for 10 years and been together for like 12, and it's like, I know I don't know her. I mean, I feel like that is like the most, the most genuine place you can get to is accepting that point that you can't know somebody ever, that you can understand a lot, but you're never going to really know it because you didn't go through what they went through. You got their explanation of what they went through, and that's all you can ever get, and that's one-sided at best, and still gonna be skewed by their perceptions, and it's not, hearing that story isn't going to affect you or give you an understanding to where you can really know where they're at. And that's just the way it is at all times. And anytime you try to make somebody feel better, it's an act of control. It's an act of you trying to control somebody else. And the only honest control you ever have in any situation is over yourself. And, so I just feel like the important thing to do is to really just try to be with people and listen to them and not try to fix it, not try to even comment, not try to, give advice, but more just hear it and let them know you hear it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. That's powerful. And I know it's funny to know the whole story and then ask you to tell it, but I don't know the whole story by any means, as we've just touched on. Like, yeah, every time I'm sure that you talk about it, it becomes a little more clear to anyone listening. And but that just being there with you was captured by just in a very prominent way, I guess, 4 years ago when you how many times have you in your mind attempted to commit suicide?
Well, it's like we touched on that in my interview with Peg about how there is this like spectrum of that word and attempt, and how what goes on inside somebody and what is perceived by others is so often so different. That, I've often wondered with a lot of people, where is the line where it's not, a cry for attention, and where it is an actual attempt at suicide, and where it's a just like misguided thoughts and an opportunity in a situation. There's times when I've been really depressed and you find yourself in a situation like you're next to a road and there's a bus coming and you're like, maybe, and it's like, is that considered an attempt? You know what I mean? And that's something that isn't understood or really even talked about a lot, I don't think. It's like, where is those lines? And in a lot of literature, they talk about how the difference is having a method in your mind. If you have a plan for how you're going to do it, that's like one of the big lines. But like I said, in situations like that, when you're just kind of like, yeah, I could just do this, or it's like, it's kind of a gray area. But to get to real, like, premeditated, like, I'm in a bad place, I need to get myself out of it, and this is the solution that's in my head, and that kind of an attempt, I would say there's been at least 5 that were pretty scary. 3 of them were similar to what I described with Peg about trying to hang myself. I don't know what to say about that. It's just one of those things that I kind of picked up the knowledge of how it's supposed to be done, and an actual execution by hanging. Uh-huh. And there's a fairly technical, very specific method of how you do it, to where it is a very quick and humane way, and it's like if it's done right. Mm-hmm. And that was always kind of appealing to me, that is the thing, that the emotion that's always gotten to me isn't that I wanted to die, it's that it's just that you I didn't want to be anymore. It's like I didn't want to cause any harm or damage to anybody, and I have some what do you call it's just mostly my anxiety. But what happens is that because of my size and I have a real big voice, that when I have an anxiety attack, it can be very frightening to the people around me. And I've never really gotten violent with anybody or anything like that, but my actions have been perceived as violent to people because it's erratic, and I'm a big guy and it's scary. Mm-hmm. And I understand that, but it's also it gets to be really hard, because it spirals me into this situation where I feel very guilty about that behavior, and it's more acceptable or more unacceptable than it is in most people because of, you know, my size and everything.
And for me, I find myself feeling that way, that I've blown up too quickly or too much, or in a situation where I have too much physical power, even though I'm not threatening with a physical violence. I just am using my body and being loud, and it becomes very intimidating. And I've found that, guilt in that too. But usually those moments are self-preservation moments, and you're offended enough, right? To like, I'm sure an anxiety attack comes on completely different, but it's a purging of internal emotions. It's a self-defense. Like, I can't handle this, so get it away from me, I think is...
Right.
And you should, I think, be able to ask for that. Like, society shouldn't say you should be guilty because you have all of that stuff in you. They should say, like, let it out, go into another room, we'll all be separate, but high five afterwards because it's not in you anymore, right? Like...
Well, and that's something I really wanted to touch on, because it's like there's this sentiment and statement you hear often about how suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And, that is totally true. But I feel like there's this disconnect where on the other side of that, we can't accept a suicide attempt as something that was temporary.
Huh.
You know, to where it's like once somebody does attempt suicide or talks about suicide, they get kind of permanently labeled as that way. So, you know, and I feel like that's something that, you know, as society we need to kind of work on, is that forgiveness and that understanding that it was temporary. Oh, you were dealing with some crazy shit and you went there. That's cool, but you're not there anymore, right? You know, and like let it go and not hold on to that, you know, judgment or that like, whoa, you know, because all that is fear. That's our fear of that person hurting us by committing suicide. You know, that if they die by suicide, that is going to cause us pain. And so we're scared of that, and we react out of fear by either distancing ourselves from that person or judging them and, you know, compelling them to stop that behavior. And none of that is healthy.
Yeah. And so all of this kind of touches, you said a lot of the psychology or the books written on it talk about the method as the thing to be focused on when you're measuring an attempt of somebody trying to commit suicide.
Yeah, the plan, if they have one.
And I can't help but thinking with everything you're saying that is completely backwards, and that the method is maybe the availability of getting it done, but that the real underlying drive is that you don't want to be here for whatever reason. Like, you spend time not wanting to be around, and then you see a bus and that gives you a method, or you know how to tie a knot and that gives you, it's a solution. Like,
right. I mean, there is a bit of that, but you know, it's a moving target, because it's like everybody's an individual. Every single suicide is unique. And so they have to find some sort of metric to look for, to judge, to you know, some sort of red flag to try to look for, you know. And that's, you know, one of the big things I feel like that is so important with CCFA's project is to just record as many stories and get as much information, like just detailed stories about people's experiences, so that we can just look at it more. Because that's what I don't feel like is happening. And I mean, it is to a certain extent in one field, but you know, in like, you know, with psychiatry and therapy, it's like, yeah, they talk to people that are dealing with this, but it needs to be looked at on a broader level, to where, you know, educators and peers, you know, and, you know, just parents and, you know, society in general can have access to this information and trying to better understand and flesh out, you know, what it looks like to be in that situation where that is the way out.
And I think, yeah, it should be a study of all of us and of philosophy too. Like it's something that we need to gain an understanding of, and so we should use science, and we should use art, and we should use philosophy.
Absolutely.
But it's hard for me because I have always known internally, like, I've got such a strong drive to just never die. Like, no matter how much I've thought in my moment, like, wouldn't it be nice to, like, have a bullet hit me in the head and I'm done here? That's the closest I've ever let myself get to being like, hey, take me off this earth. It's like, yeah, it would be cool to end it, but no thank you, sir. Like, I'm tooth and nail. It's just something in me that I've always known, but that makes me feel like I have to be so careful trying to understand something like suicide. And I am a big fan of philosophy and of thinking things through, even though I don't understand them. I'm trying to understand them. But with suicide, it's probably been the hardest thing for me to approach throughout my whole life, like seeing friends who deal with it, but not feeling like I don't have the hall pass to even have an opinion on it.
Right.
Which honestly, my opinion was completely uninformed for a very long time, but that is probably part of what kept me uninformed, that just feeling that barrier of like, oh, I don't, because I've never been on the side where I would like label somebody or judge them. I guess I would be on the more careful side where I would like, I hope I don't make it worse, or act like I'm knowing something I shouldn't.
Right. And you know, it's hard because, again, it's like every situation is unique. And some people are going to, you know, react badly to it being talked about. You know, it's like, I remember experience where a friend of mine's mother committed suicide. This was a lot later in life, after my mother, but I heard about it. And I, you know, saw her and, you know, came up and expressed my condolences and expressed how, you know, that, you know, my mother had committed suicide and that, you know, I have had some insights into dealing with that, and if, you know, she wanted to talk at all, to please let me know. And she was honestly like mortified because I knew that her mom had committed suicide and not just that she had died. You know, so it's just such a touchy subject to try to figure out the correct way to handle it, because, you know, it's almost like we can't assume, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about listening and learning to truly hear what the individual is asking for and trying to respond to that. You know, and I feel like, you know, hopefully we can develop like a toolbox full of methods and responses and strategies to where it's like, well, if they're looking for this, we can go this direction. If they're looking for this, we can move over here. But it's not going to be, you know, here you go. This is what it is. Oh, you feel that way? You know, it can't be that way, because we are all individuals and we have to find a individual response to it.
Yeah. What do you feel, from your perspective and your best knowledge, what was your mom's process with suicidal thoughts, and what you might be able to guess could have helped or was getting in the way?
I don't think she had any real access to you know, anybody to talk to. My dad was, I mean, I don't mean to imply unavailable, but like just they, you know, it was the, you know, the 80s, the early 90s. That was actually, I think, yeah, it was 1990. But yeah, it just there wasn't a lot of open conversations about it. You know, I mean, I at that time had been going to therapy and you know, a psychiatrist actually, and I honestly feel like me going to therapy and needing that was on a certain level a cause for my mom's situation, that she had a really hard time accepting that, you know, because she was an educator and she had been this, you know, highly qualified, you know, educator that was prized in our community, and then her child was one of these problem childs, you know, that, you know, she dealt with in school and saw all the time, and it was like she was having a really hard time connecting that, you know, in herself, that, you know, and accepting that. And you know, it caused a lot of just dissonance in herself, and I don't think she had any way to deal with that or cope with that. You know, talking back with my father and my older brother, my brother somewhat remembers seeing her, you know, like have outbursts and, you know, like have anxiety attacks, but I remember it fairly frequently. And you know, I don't know the reasoning behind that, you know, but I do know it's fairly common in a lot of situations, family situations, where parents will, you know, present certain things and certain emotions more to certain children. You know, that and it's usually because of some dynamic or some, you know, there's always reasons, but, you know, it does happen fairly frequently that there's, you know, one child that gets a little bit more of a certain emotion or something, you know. And I'm not trying to in any way blame my mom. I mean, there was really extenuating circumstances, like I mentioned in the interview with Peg, that there was I had another brother that was in between me and my oldest brother, Tommy, that died of SIDS before I was born. And I know that affected both my parents, you know, emotionally very much. And, you know, I mean, honestly, you know, then another thing that needs to be mentioned that I don't know how much it's been touched on is that my parents were both very religious. They were Catholic, and, you know, my dad was a lectern and, you know, would read scriptures in front of the church all the time. And, you know, my mom being a teacher was just, you know, a big part of the community. And, you know, they were a big part of like what they call this program that was called a Marriage Encounter, which was like a, you know, marriage counseling program through the Catholic Church. And, you know, they got real involved with that after Tommy's death. And, you know, I don't know, I'm not in any way, you know, trying to knock that, you know, what they did or the methodology that they went with. But in the results, it seemed like you know, they didn't really deal with a lot of stuff emotionally, and, you know, in the long term, that there's from both my parents, a lot of what they went through came back and continued to be problematic. So, but yeah, specifically her methodology for dealing with her thoughts and stuff was mostly just that bottling up, you know, and not coping with it on, you know, any real tangible level until it got to the point where she was lashing out. And that usually wasn't like violent as much as, like I said, like an anxiety attack, like her just, and two, I think her profession had a big contributing factor to it, that because, being a teacher and being such a public figure, she wasn't able to express her shortcomings or her needs for help, and that she felt that it would compromise her position and her authority as a teacher, and that the parents and everybody would lose faith in her as a educator. And I think that stigma was a huge contributing factor to her not seeking help. I mean, not even not seeking help, that I feel like it wasn't even like on the table, like it wasn't even offered. You know what I mean? It was like, for her to seek help would mean that she would have to completely redefine herself and find a different career, and that may not have been 100% true, but I feel like that was her perception.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. What were the circumstances leading up to, and I really mean the mental circumstances for you leading up to your 4 years ago suicide attempt, and then how did you feel after it, directly after, and going out of that process?
Well, there was a lot of sleep deprivation going on. That's someplace my anxiety goes quite often, is that I have trouble sleeping and suffer from anxiety or insomnia. And so, and it was also, we had my one daughter was really young and having trouble sleeping through the night. And so that was causing a lot of anxiety and problems. My wife had was at a fairly new job, and there was a lot of stress in that, and there was a lot of she had a really high pressure meeting. I believe maybe it wasn't an actual meeting, but she had a thing happening that day, I remember, that was way up on her list of priorities, and in the front of her mind, and that she was fairly stressed about. And the way the spiral kind of goes for me is, I've described it in some writings and some stuff, but never in a recording. And so I'd like to talk about this perception that I feel like often suicide is that place where your anxiety and your depression is like meet. You know what I mean? It's like your anxiety is just like racing and like terrified and like just just running full speed, just not making sense, like sees something and goes for it, sees something else, oh God, that's what the problem is, and it's like that. And then your depression's just there like, fuck, just like, this is where we are, this sucks, Mm-hmm. And it's, that point where all of a sudden, your depression just like this, reaching out like this, and your anxiety's running by like this, and they lock hands. And the depression can't move, and the anxiety can't stop, and they just start spinning, full speed, spinning, and you just go downhill. And it gets to that point where there is no rationality. There's no real thoughts that make any sense. All you have is these two warring emotions that you can't control and are just taking you down into a hole. And the problem is, in that moment, is that most of the other people there are dealing with shit too. And they're not like casual observers that are just, they're witnessing it. you know, and you desperately need help. You desperately need a hand or somebody just to, you know, interrupt that process. But, you know, like I said, most of the time the other people in the situation are coping with their own emotions, and, you know, they're not in a place to just react perfectly. And, you know, so we, you know, me, like, that's what happened that morning. Is it was first thing in the morning. I hadn't slept hardly at all. Had been up for hours, like, just stressed, and my anxiety was racing. But, you know, and I was scared to express and, you know, do anything. We lived in a really small place, and, you know, it kind of made noises and creaked and stuff. So I was like trying my best just to lay still, because I knew my wife had this important situation the next day at work, and I was trying not to, you know, to let her get her rest that she needed. And, you know, she got up, and, you know, I had been up for hours and having an internal anxiety attack, and I, you know, kind of released some of that, you know, frantic energy at her, like, before she was even really, you know, fully awake. And, you know, she reacted very understandably, and was, let's just, you know, and, you know, wasn't great. I mean, like, was just like, I can't deal with this, please back away, I don't, you know, I gotta wake up a little bit. And, you know, yeah, she was a little harsh and a little prickly, but not in any way, you know, I mean, it's totally understandable, her acting like that. But, yeah, to me, you know, I couldn't back away. You know, I was so already desperate and in need of, you know, some sort of connection at that point. And, you know, it just turned into that push, and, you know, from both of us, to where it's like I kept wanting to just to get a little bit of attention and, you know, help with where I was, and she desperately didn't want anything to do with it, because she needed to stay focused on what she needed to do and where she needed to be. And, yeah, it just escalated from there.